I'm your host, Evan, and today we're going to be talking about Aristotle's prime mover, also known as the unmoved mover. Hello, guys, and welcome to another day of a crash course in philosophy basics. In order to fully understand Aristotle's concept of the prime mover or unmoved mover, there's a few things that we have to address before we can actually get there. I've laid out a few things that we're going to hit and have a little fun. Follow me. As we all know, Aristotle lived quite some time ago. Born somewhere around 384 BC, his work really didn't start till about the age of 17 or 18 when he moved to Athens to start his schooling under Plato. Most of Aristotle's works were published out of his gymnasium school and library he founded called Lyceum. One of Aristotle's great claims to fame was his period of time that he spent in Macedonia tutoring the future uh, Alexander the Great. During his time as tutor of Alexander, he had the opportunity to explore a lot of different pathways that he hadn't had before, and he was afforded the luxury of being able to explore them by his position. Aristotle takes us from illusion to substance. Plato believed that the world was basically an illusion. That what we see is just a less perfect form of what it could be, and that there are things out there that things could be that are better and intrinsically perfect. He used this to describe. He used the allegory of the cave to describe this. Plato's cave was an interesting place. He described it as being uh, a, a large cavern illuminated from the rear by a fire, and they're a group of people that are have been bound their entire lives, so they can't move, they can't look at each other, they can only see the shadows that pass in front of them, and the shadows are generated by these things that pass in front of the fire behind them. Um, but they give name to these things, and they test each other, like uh, who, and they find who can describe the forms the best. And these people are trapped there. But he postulated, what if one of them was freed magically and brought out from the cave and into the light? Well, outside the cave, but one couldn't see once they got outside the cave. Everything would be blurry. At first, the person would only be able to. He couldn't look at the sun. He'd have to look indirectly to try to understand it, see it. But as his vision adjusted to the daylight, um, he began to realize that what he saw in the cave wasn't real. Uh, he was out in the world and he had found what is real. He, in his moment of enlightenment, returned to the cave to try to free his fellow prisoners. But sadly, they made fun of him because he was no longer able to see in the dimly lit cavern. They said that his perception of reality was flawed and that he could no longer distinguish the forms as well as the others. And this is Plato's ideas on forms was that one needs to focus on what things should be like so that we can more clearly define what is wrong in the world so we can make the world a better place. In Plato's view, these forms were like a blueprint to the universe, and that, following his philosophy, there is an ideal state to everything. While Aristotle did reject these ideas of forms, it did lead him to some important conclusions about reality. Primarily being, Plato was flawed, and forms is a needless doubling of reality, and that these perfect things couldn't be perfect things if they don't possess substance, which makes them inherently and measurably real as the thing that they're supposed to be. A tree needs to have the material wood in order to be considered a tree. And if there is no wood intrinsically in the tree wouldn't be a tree, and then thus there can be no archetypal or ideal tree. Aristotle thought, unlike Plato, there are things that appear to be stable and understandable by observing things. This is due to the fact, according to Aristotle, that the tree is a tree for the duration of its life, even though it undergoes changes during its life. This being said, Aristotle further rejects that a tree could exist before the tree even existed, which Plato asserted as the archetypal tree. These ideas of ideal forms laid the groundwork for Aristotle's ideas of causality. Aristotle thought we have perceptions of things like the tree, and we aren't born with any innate knowledge of things, nor do we at one point know the ideal form of the tree and somehow forget it. Instead, we learn things through experiences. We learn at some point that a tree is, as opposed to another thing like a bush or a boat, it is a tree. Our experiences shape our perceptions of reality. This relates to his theory of four causes. The first one, material, being what something is made of. Second, formal, the definition that we give something or how we describe it. Third, efficient, what that thing or that changed thing that caused that thing to be the way that it is. So, like a carpenter intended a chair to be a chair. That's what its efficient cause is. And the fourth cause is the final cause, that for the sake of which it occurs. Like, I walked to get somewhere. For sake of utility, and to better correspond with Aristotle's original thoughts, we will be working from the efficient and final causes to better elaborate upon what the prime mover is. Kinesis, Greek for change, is happening constantly. We are beings thrust into the future relentlessly by these processes of change. One thing preceded another and so forth. This idea of causality, the efficient cause, Reality is built around our perceptions of this process. In Aristotle's mind, this stretches from the beginning of the first cause to the end of the final cause. But what caused the first efficient cause? How could change have started? If there was an event, or thing, or happening before that change initiated, what was that initiator? Aristotle's explanation for the beginning of change was this unmoved mover. He postulated change had to have had a beginning, if there was to be an end or final cause to existence or meaning to existence, or a return to apathy. He observed everything has a beginning and an end. It cannot be an infinite process. We have to have gotten to where we are somehow. How do we even know where we are if it's just infinite? There is a here and a now. We live towards, in, and through. And once we've gone through it, we cannot go back through it. Like a tree sprouts roots, lives, and then dies, and then by all reasonable observation is no longer a tree. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. We may know there was a tree, and the matter of it may remain, but it can no longer be said to be a tree. So there had to be a point of initial change, he postulated. There had to be something that was a mover, but since so, there is something that moved something that began all of the change that surrounds us. But if it was the first thing that moved something, and nothing had moved it prior, it must have been unmoved. Aristotle followed logic down to approximate some of the basic characteristics that a being without change must have. This mover is unchanged, and it must have many different properties that are intrinsic to that of a being which experiences no change. He thought the prime mover must be eternal, because the nature of our reality and the nature of what we do is temporary. So something that was unchanged would be eternal. Um, the prime mover is not a sensible being. It is something that exists outside of the sensible world. Where in which the prime mover resides, the place outside of our perception, because a sensible object can be changed, according to Aristotle's second part of Metaphysics, Book 12. If it interacted with the world, it would be changed, and thus moved. It cannot gain knowledge of our world, and does not know of our universe. This is the case because knowledge of our imperfect reality would diminish the nature of a being without change, rendering it imperfect. It is a completely impersonal being outside of our universe that all things are drawn towards by its pure actualization. By this, it has no potential because it cannot change. Aristotle then concluded that if the prime mover is pure actualization, it has no potential to change because it cannot change, and potential is the essence of change. Also, the prime mover is a thinking being, but because of his perfection, he must only think of himself, because it is the best and most pleasant thought, he postulated, and is this thought which makes up its essence, and its essence is which makes up its thought, making its life self-dependent. He does this because if he is an eternal and unmoved being, to think of anything other than himself that would make him imperfect and moved. Though he does suggest that he could also think of other perfect beings without change. Furthermore, it cannot have any magnitude, finite or infinite, but that of singleness instead. It has no parts and is indivisible. It just is. Something that can be divided is not perfect, and can exhibit change to be more perfect. The prime mover is good. This is the case because without its existence there would be no existence, and its necessity for existence is what makes it good by existing in that singular way. Since the prime mover is alive and eternal, it exists must be critical for the survival of the universe. And Aristotle concluded that this prime mover must be God. Aristotle was not without his detractors. Many people have criticized this theory for quite a few reasons. Let me explain. One of these criticisms is that Aristotle states in the second part of the Metaphysics book 12 that change is motion, and, follow me, he attributes motion-like qualities to the prime mover. And by that notion, it must have had some form of motion to initiate motion. And if you say something with motion has change, then that it must imply to all things with motion. So, by his own logic, the prime mover must have motion. Aristotle makes a fundamental error of composition. He expands the smaller systems to a much larger scale. Just because the composition of the smaller things is the same as the larger things doesn't necessarily mean that they will have the same outcome, despite it being part of the same system. Furthermore, time must have always existed, because things exist in time, so it can be presumed, even before the first push, that there had to be things there. So yes, could mover be God, or who created God, or a larger God? No, this falls to the problem of infinite regress, which is the exact problem that Aristotle was trying to avoid with Plato's concepts on forms. Some ask, why is the unmoved mover exempt from the laws that govern everything else? Even if he was outside time, he must have come into being. Beyond that, why and how would a being that only exists thinking of itself ever had the ability or the capability to initiate reality? To generate something less than its own self would diminish its perfection. And beyond that, if something existed outside of time and change, how could it have generated time or change? Considering that, Aristotle is falling in the same trap his master Plato fell into. Aristotle criticized Plato for needlessly doubling reality with forms. Aristotle does this too. If you have an unmoved mover existing outside of reality, in its own reality, then by that nature of generating a reality for this being, Aristotle himself has doubled reality in order to explain reality and causality. It just ends up being metaphysical dead weight. Aristotle's also suffering from a problem that he assumes that something has to have a beginning or an end. It can be easily postulated that the universe could be cyclical. Time could just continue around and around and around again in a pattern with the beginning being the end and the end being the beginning. It's the assumption that infinite regress is the problem and that infinite regress is flawed. This is may not necessarily be the case. Some argue for one to say there is no prime mover, like a god or gods, is akin to saying you are a god or that all things are gods, and that this is a form of hubris, and that we have things far outside of our control that dictate the path of our lives. Motions that started long before we were here and will continue long after. They would continue to say, we are slaves to this causal reality till the universe finally ends, and there is no causes and no interaction at all. But with this person must admit that the universe will die a cold, meaningless death, devoid of meaning, other than the void of its own meaning. That defeats the whole purpose of the argument. That being that there's a causal finite meaning to the universe, which is what Aristotle was trying to assert. A beginning and an end. The unmoved mover couldn't have generated something with end because the unmoved mover has no beginning or end, and have a end would make it less than perfect. So it makes God unnecessary and the prime mover becomes unnecessary as well. Coming back from infinite regress, to better understand our world, one, or at least one seeking a broader understanding, should seek guidance from those who have come before them and had the most effect on it. Aristotle is said to be one of the greatest thinkers of all time, and this is why we take apart one of his more criticized thoughts. We put them under closer examination, because philosophers' flawed ideas can shed light on to our ideas that we hold so true, and to give us a better or greater understanding on the own flaws of our own understanding of existence now.